For these 6 teaching films, I have with me 6 children from my school. 5 of them have been here some time and are already acquainted with my approach. The youngest one, however, has never held a violin in her hands. Even for her, these demonstrations will be of some value, especially as they will be later clarified and explained to her by the older ones. For the older ones, they will serve as a review of what they have learned. In fact, I hope these lessons may be of use to all violinists of all ages. You all know this object. You have, I believe, spent many hours with it. I hope pleasant hours. It's worth the effort. First of all, it's a lovely thing as a companion, and it is even lovelier when it's made to sound. That is perhaps a little more complicated than it appears when a good violinist plays. And it is precisely with that in mind, with the idea that I want you to enjoy it, that I want others to enjoy you playing the violin. I'd like you to feel free as you communicate your own thoughts and feelings and those of the great composers who have written for the violin. It's with that object in mind that I have prepared these lessons. It will demand a rigorous discipline and a very exacting, precise approach on your own part. In fact, don't imagine that playing the violin is something that, once mastered, need never be thought about again. These lessons, I hope, will be concise and clear enough that they may enable you to return to the task, to the almost daily task, even as you get proficient. But always, of course, it will be easier with each day. My approach is based on a few basic principles. These will become clearer as the lessons themselves progress. At first they may appear not so clear, but I shall have to state them nonetheless at this point. We all know the principles, the basic principles that govern all technique. These are the economic use of energy, the smooth turnings between directions so that there is a continuity, the rounded corners, anticipation, which is extremely important, so as not to be taken by surprise, elasticity, strength, speed, and of course, a quiet breathing rhythm, which is not upset at any time. But we are concerned in how to achieve these, and I have been governed by 3 interlocking principles, as you will see in these lessons. The first one is to look upon violin playing in its 3-dimensional context and break it down into the motions in each dimension. There is, of course, the vertical against gravity, which is up and down. There is the directional, as when we walk or draw the bow across the strings. And there is the sideways motion. Each one of these, we develop and build our strength, our elasticity, our resilience in these. But then the second part comes in when we have to put them together again, because there is no single motion that occurs in one dimension alone. We put them together again into circles and ellipses to assure the smoothness of the technique. And finally, the third part, we have to build a sympathetic coordinating structure of motion in our whole body, which will support even the smallest of these specific required motions. Now, I would like to illustrate these with an example on the violin. This anticipates our lessons, actually, but may serve to clarify your minds. Supposing I do this figure with the left hand. This can be broken into its 3 component parts. The vertical, which is playing with gravity, keeping our hand at a certain level, and the horizontal along the length of the string, and finally, the lateral swing of the whole arm. Actually, even when working on these elements separately, we must never completely forget the presence of the other two, but we concentrate on each one separately, remembering that there is not a single motion that does not involve the whole limb from the fingertip to the shoulder blade, in fact. I will do the same figure slowly, trying to exaggerate each motion so that you may see them if you can. The very same principles apply to the right hand. If I play this simple stroke, this involves again the maintaining of the arm at a certain level, that is the playing with gravity, with the vertical element. It involves the stroke, and what is perhaps less obvious, it involves the lateral motion of the whole arm, which becomes quite clear in a stroke like this. These elements would not be complete even when put together, as we do into the circular and elliptical forms, without the third element, which is the supporting motion, the cooperating and coordinating motion of the whole body. This involves posture and elasticity. Now, posture involves elongation, that is, stretching, and balance. We all know that we can't balance a soft object. You can't balance a pillow. But you can balance a cane or an umbrella because they are long and straight. Now, the longer and straighter we are, the more finely balanced, the more delicately poised we are, the less energy we require to keep ourselves erect, and also the more subtle and rapid are our adjustments to imbalance. This depends as much on our feet as it does on our head. To begin with our feet, if we keep them together, as long as we are still, it's all right. But if we begin playing, we might easily fall off balance. If, however, we keep them too far apart, that's rather awkward and ungainly because we can't shift weight from one foot to another without jumping a bit. Whereas if we keep them approximately this distance apart, we have a good base, solid enough, and at the same time flexible enough, and we can move weight from one leg to the other. We can swing the body, we can swing the head, and we are always in balance. Now to go to the other extreme, to our head, which is most important in violin playing, but not only to think with, but simply as another part of our anatomy, a limb that has weight and that is very mobile and flexible. And unless we keep its flexibility, unless we keep the neck soft, we may get into trouble. Many violinists suffer from pains and stiffness and tension in the shoulders and neck. Its only function in violin playing is to touch the violin and sometimes lean slightly on it, pulling back, preventing the violin from falling away. Now, as to the general elasticity of the body, I would like to give you an example to prove how soft and floating the body should feel. We can start a motion in the arms from the body. That is not the way you would play normally, though the body must always be prepared to prepare the motion of the limbs. But supposing it came exclusively from the body, the limbs would be floating, ready to move, and the body takes the initiative. In this way, that should be the background feeling of the body. Obviously, when you will play, you will not make that kind of motion, though at times there are certain strokes that demand quite a wide swing of the body. Now I would like to put the violin aside and we will begin at the beginning, which means attuning our whole body before we can attune ourselves to the violin. Karen will demonstrate the first preparatory exercise, a combination exercise that normally would take, and I'm sure Karen spends at least 10 minutes on it every day. But now we are only interested in marking the principles. We begin in the crouched position, where the body is completely relaxed, leaning on itself on the floor, the head is hanging, the arms are on the ground, and we take a few deep breaths, and on an exhalation we straighten the legs, still leaning on the hands. A few more breaths, and on an inhalation we reach the standing position. Here we check our posture and see that the feet are parallel, that the arches of the feet are working, the knees straight, the back straight, stomach pulled in, back straight and pulled back, shoulders down, head up, and we bring the hands to the horizontal position, breathing and stretching at each point we make, as we do again in this upstretched position on our toes. Again, breathing, we bring the palms together. Now, at the 45-degree angle, we work the arms into the shoulder blades, stretching them out and letting them fall back. We do the same in the horizontal position, first rotating the arms, and then one shoulder after the other, coordinated with the head. While the one shoulder stretches, the other one falls back into the shoulder blade, and both together in circles, again coordinated with the head falling back and forth. Further head exercises, twisting, stretching back, forward, chin forward, chin back, and finally sideways in the Indian motion. And that is the first exercise. Thank you, Karen. And now Elizabeth will proceed with the second exercise, which already comes a little closer to playing the violin in that it is based on continuous rotation. Collapsing at the waist, everything hanging, including the arms and the head. Nothing is moving until Elizabeth starts a gentle sway, which induces a passive rotation in the arms. This is continued and maintained as the arms have to be more and more carried, but the rotation does not stop, nor does the body sway stop. And gradually she comes into the violin playing position with both arms at approximately shoulder level. And the head too is participating in the motion, creating a kind of massaging, pleasant motion, which should bring us closer to a happy way of playing the violin. Then, continuing the motion, we make rotation exercises with the wrists, remembering both in this down bow rotation, as it were, and in the up bow rotation, which is in the opposite direction, that the fingers have to also be passive and move in their own joints. And then moving to the elbow, we hang the forearms and swing. And then we swing them above our heads, fairly energetically, exercising the muscles of our back. And then we go into the full arm rotation, beginning in one direction. You see that the arms cross alternately, once above the left, once above the right. And that can be done as energetically as we like, in the opposite direction as well. It can be done also faster and with greater swing. And then in opposite directions, opposite arms, and in the opposite direction now, opposite arms. That's very good. And finally, into the figure 8 exercise, which is down bow, up bow, as it were, in both arms. At each point of the extreme up bow and down bow, the shoulders stretch the back stretches. Also the down bow, that's right. Good, Elizabeth. That's fine. Now, I would like to show you a few exercises with which you may be less familiar. Can you balance on one leg, David? That's not bad. Very good. Now, balance is a very important thing for violinists standing, because they must never be in a static, firm position. They must always be fluid. And therefore, standing on two legs must not give them the illusion that they are rooted in the ground. On the contrary. And that is why, again, these exercises, and in the yogi terminology, they call them stork exercises, because they are on one leg, are the best way of becoming aware of balance. There are a few variants to this exercise, which I'll show you. One of them is this one, back. And, of course, one of the things you must remember is to pull your shoulder down with the leg. It stretches the shoulder very well. Back again. Right out. There is another exercise for people who stand a great deal, which is extremely useful. That is called the shoulder stand. In that, the feet are right up in the air, and the blood is drained from the feet, relieving the pressure on the feet that we gather as we stand on them all day. And it stretches the neck very well, and it irrigates the head. From there, I'll go into what's known as the plow pose. That's when the feet touch the ground behind the head, and finally into the complete relaxation. This well-earned relaxation is one of the most delightful states of being. It should always follow upon the exertion of violin practice, but it is particularly enjoyable when it follows upon the exercises you've just seen, because when we have breathed deeply and stretched and swung and balanced, at that time when we come into this position, the limbs feel their full weight. The arms and the head all lie on the ground as if they were glued to the ground. And it induces a kind of complete, it's not quite sleep, but it is very akin to sleep, and in fact is a state of being more relaxed even than sleep, because there's no twitching and there's no tossing about. In this first film, we have considered and demonstrated various basic principles essential to violin playing. I have spoken of the three-dimensional continuity in which we work, of the need for stretching, for flexibility, for balance, and of the command of the space around us. I have tried to evolve exercises which would imprint these principles upon our muscles, our body, our habits, so that subsequently, when we speak of the violin technique, we will be able to apply these principles to the smallest details of that technique. But it would be a mistake to assume that these principles are restricted to the technical and the physical, because these very same conceptions apply equally well to the mind and the heart. For we speak of stretching the mind, of maintaining the balance of our thoughts and of our feelings, so that we may be subtly reacting to the smallest influences around us. We must remember that we live in this three-dimensional continuum, and that our minds and our hearts operate in the same way as our bodies do. This lesson is going to be about the bow, but we will begin by using a stick because it's the simplest object on which we can experiment and learn about the principles of our hold, the position of the fingers, matters of balance and pressure. Let us start by trying to balance it at the middle point. Would you like to try this? Find the exact middle of your stick where it balances. Then between the thumb on its side and the middle finger, the second finger, with dropped wrist, with rounded second finger and rounded thumb as well on its side, hold the stick. Actually, hold is an exaggeration. Just keep the stick from falling. Little Karen, your little finger is pointing straight out. Try to put it on top of the stick now. And the first finger, let it lean and embrace the stick. The fourth finger is too far on top of the stick. It should be a little behind, just nearly at the top. And the space between the fingers must be approximately equal. They must be very soft, the whole hand must be hanging, no tension anywhere at all, because you don't need it to hold the stick in the middle. That's not bad at all for the first time, Karen. Look at Rosemary. She does it very well. Rosemary, can you move the hand down begin moving it down to its normal position and see where you begin feeling the weight of the stick in the little finger where it begins balancing it. You see? The sooner you feel that, the more sensitive your fingers are. Of course, they must remain sensitive even at the very fog. And there the weight is the full weight of the stick in the hand. Incidentally, so that we are sure of our nomenclature, violinists call this finger the first, this the second, this the third, that the fourth. This applies to both hands, of course, because in violin playing, the fingers are always opposed to the thumb. Piano playing, they are all equal. To begin with, this first hold, the ring, as it were, the middle finger and the thumb. The thumb must be touching the stick at the top edge, including a bit of the nail, so that it may follow the stroke in the natural direction of its own joints. The thumb would normally slide if it weren't anchored to one spot. In the beginning, you will find it will slide. This is the action it should be able to do, and this is the action it will do when it is finally established in contact with the stick. The second finger touches, which is this, touches the stick along the distance between the first and second joint and into the first joint. It mainly around the first joint. The first finger leans on the stick, not completely on its side, but again at about a 45-degree angle, so that it is in a position to exert pressure and to be in line with the rest of the knuckles. It is not actually correct to speak of pressure when it is really the weight of the arm that is allowed to fall on the first finger, resisted by this section of the first finger, which carries the weight, which must never cave in. It also touches the bow, when necessary, to its tip, all the way around the stick. The fourth finger is nearly vertical, but it is exerting its pressure not on top of the bow, but slightly on the side of the bow, because it balances again the first phalange of the first finger. If it were on top of the bow, the first finger would lose contact with the bow completely. The third finger has, to a certain extent, the function of the fourth, in that it can assist the lift of the fourth. We can hold it a little with the third. But it also has another function in what we call the up bow. That is when the arm moves from its extended position towards the body, and then it has an action against the thumb, which pushes the bow against the first finger, which can then apply its pressure, which it couldn't do if the third finger were not there. Our hold of the bow is built of two arcs. The one we have considered the middle hold between thumb and second finger, and the other one is the bridge, of which one pair is this first finger, and the other pair is separated into two legs, the third and fourth fingers. We must always be aware of this bridge, which spreads the weight of the arm, the weight which is mainly transferred to the first finger, but then retransferred back to the whole bridge that carries it. It is possible to illustrate this feeling in the hand. If we imagined that the pairs were allowed to move, they would move in that direction. And although this is not, our fingers don't slide on the stick, inside the hand we feel these pressures. We can exercise, however, the spreading of the knuckles, which is a good exercise for violinists in both hands. Sometimes the first finger is more closely bridged, as it were, with the fourth finger, at other times with the third finger, and often with both simultaneously. It is necessary to remember our basic principle of space. There must be space between the fingers, space in this way through the circle, including the thumb, which allows each finger to act in its own particular way. The angle of the knuckles is at almost a 45-degree angle. This has several reasons. Our main articulations in the wrist and the knuckles, if we held an object normally, are vertical. This would not do for violin playing, where we are concerned with a continuous stroke, a melodic line. This involves a horizontal motion. Therefore, we bend our knuckles and wrists slightly to give us the advantage of the stroke, keeping the thumb at right angles to the stick. There is another reason for this. The fourth finger, with its shortness, must be, as we said, almost vertically on top of the stick. Whereas the first finger, this joint, this, what I call the phalange, must be approximately in its resting middle normal position, horizontal, which means that the hand has to rise from the horizontal of the first finger to the vertical of the fourth. This accounts for this bend. A third reason for this angle is the position of the hand when we play at the point. That is, when the limb is at its farthest from the body, its outstretched position, in contrast to its folded position when we approach the frog or the nut of the bow, where it is nearest the body. Our balance must be equally secure, both in the position of the wrist when it is bent in the folded position, as when it is at the end of an extended arm. This involves great flexibility. The flexibility of the pressure and the lift in either the down bow direction going into the extension or the up bow direction going into the fold. And that happens along every smallest segment of the stroke. Flexibility is required in many ways, as not only pushing and pulling and lifting, but also in circles. In circles which take us from one string to another, or take us from one stroke into the next, or in very complicated ellipses and circles involved in connecting the two halves of the bow. To test the softness and flexibility of your fingers, it is a good idea to hold the stick vertically, raise it with your fingers and the wrist to maximum height, and let the weight of the stick carry your fingers and wrist down. Invert the pose, raise the stick, and let the fingers fall with the stick down. When you are assured of the finger's flexibility, try moving the stick horizontally with fingers and wrist, and vertically. Then combine the two actions, moving the forearm, moving the arm a bit, so that you form a circle. This is a combination of the vertical and the horizontal. You can also circle in the other way, of course. Take the bow stick at this time in the middle, so that when you place your fingers on it in the correct position, there is no strain on the fingers at all. It's automatically in balance. Now, raise the stick up in the fingers into the knuckles, into the folded position of the fingers, so that the stick actually touches the inside of the fingers all the way. And then straighten out the fingers, let it fall. Again, do the same thing, raise it right in, and lengthen the fingers. That's fine. Do the same thing, moving the hand a little off-center towards the frog or nut, so you feel the weight of the stick, and do the same thing. Raise it. This way, you not only do the flexibility exercise, but you feel the balance of the bow and the fingers. Of course, we do not play the violin in the vertical direction, so I would like perhaps Karen to test David's flexibility in the horizontal direction by holding on to one end of the stick and pulling his fingers backwards and forwards, pushing and pulling the stick. That's right. Pull. The fingers should remain at the same place and be very flexible, just holding enough to not to lose their place, but flexible enough to be moved. Now, this is a crude way of testing, thank you, a crude way of testing the horizontal flexibility of the fingers by pulling and pushing. I'd like to see if your fingers are sensitive enough to react to gravity doing the same thing. Hold the stick vertically in the normal middle position. Now push the stick up with your fingers and wrist alone, straight vertically, and let it fall, pulling the fingers and the wrist with it. Again, up and down. We have to control the motion in the other way as well, so turn the stick around, again vertically, and push it up, and let it fall into the fingers. As high up as you can, and then let it fall. The thumb always rounded on its side, every finger in its right place, all the details very precisely attended to. Thank you. We have spoken a great deal about the bow without using a bow, and now I'm going to take one. We've come to the point when we can speak about strength. Strength in violin playing is of two kinds. There's the one which is concerned with the launching or catching of momentum. That is like a pulse. There is one movement which occurs intermittently with a passive reaction in between. Then there is the other kind of strength, which is required for prolonged continuous effort, as when you may be pushing or pulling a heavy load up a hill. For the first, which is essential to a change of directions, because we all know when we throw a ball against the wall, it rebounds. When we catch, we rebound. When we throw, we give one impulse and then let the ball do the rest. The same thing happens in the change of directions between the down bow and the up bow on the violin. I would like to compare it with what I might call the smack bounce. That is, if we smack something or someone, perhaps a teacher, next us, this way, we smack and bounce back, as the ball does, off the wall. This movement must be like a whiplash, like a wave. We don't smack like that. We let the movement go all the way down into the tips of our fingers and back again. Now, this would account for the change of direction from a down bow to an up bow. The other way, we would imagine something behind us or on the side that we would smack with the back of our hand. And this is the way that would happen. And that would account for the change from the up bow to the down bow. Perhaps we could illustrate that, or perhaps you'd all like to try first just the smacking movement without the stick or the bow. Just smack away from you, like that. That's it. Not so down, Rosemary, perhaps a little bit more on the side plane. That's fine. That's very good. And try it going up a little bit like that, as if you were playing on the G string. Very good. And now the change, the other smack. Very good. Now perhaps you'd like to show it with the bow. I know that you won't lose the bow when you do that. And let me see now the smack to the side, that one. Very good. And the smack with the top part of the hand back behind you or on the side. That's right. Very good. Very good. That's fine. Now, this same intermittent effort is associated with the making of a circle. If we give a circle a certain impetus, again, we just give it one push and the rest is carried around. Can you do this making circles, giving each circle its new impetus? Very good. And the other way around, the other circle? Excellent. Excellent. The second aspect of strength is involved in the continuous pull and push, as opposed to the intermittent effort of the change of directions in the smack bounce. I'm using my left hand to substitute for the friction of the bow on the strings, this friction which is in proportion to the weight of the bow on the strings. In the down bow, the continuous pull looks like this, and you will see that there's an adjustment of the whole arm rotating towards the bow, towards the first finger, and in fact involving the shoulder to a certain extent. And in the up bow, a folding back, and this continuous adjustment is required in order to keep the bow on the straight line, as otherwise it would be describing arcs like that, or like that. And finally, as we approach the frog, the folded position in which even the shoulder blade contributes to the final motion. Now, let us put the pieces of this little jigsaw together. We know the pull and the push, this continuous feeling along the whole stroke. But this stroke can also be very short, and we must still feel that same pull-push. We know the smack bounce, which is normally a very short, sharp motion, but that can also include in one motion the whole length of the bow, in either way. Now, if we put them together in a whole bow stroke, it will go something like this. We pull, we smack bounce, we push, we smack bounce. And this can easily take the form of a figure 8. Much exaggerated, but it's an easy way to get into the feeling. Having said this, I would like to remind you that we can return to the no-effort state, that state of floating sound when all we have to do is to balance the bow and to carry the weight in the shoulder. And that way the shoulder becomes quite aware of its responsibilities. We must control all degrees between this state of floating and the full strength that we may need. You see, the bow and its motion is a continuous, never-ending one, as if it were an endless bellows, as if we were given lungs which never ran out of air, never had to catch breath. That is the characteristic of violin sound and violin playing. Next time you will handle a bow, it will be to draw a sound on the violin. I hope that in our review of the preparatory exercises and the analysis of the motions, you have understood them well enough so that the next sound is going to be a nice one. Your first sound will be a lovely one. That's very rare among beginning violinists. But before we can do that, we will have to see how the violin is held. That will be the subject of our next lesson. We speak of holding the violin, but the word hold is already misleading, because when we think of holding an object, we think of holding onto it, holding fast onto it, not letting it escape. But that is a completely false conception of holding the violin. In holding the violin, we must not allow any such gripping to take place. It must be a matter of balance, of flexibility, and finally, when we apply effort or strength, it is only on the top, above the mastery of balance and flexibility, as we did with the bow. There is actually no fixed support for the violin, except when it lies on the collarbone, and no hold of the violin which must prevent its free motion, its adjustment to the stroke of the right hand, to the action of the fingers, to the sway of the body, to the sway and motion of the head, to the action of the shoulder. In fact, the first common faults are that not wanting it to drop, fearing lest it may fall, we want to put something underneath it. We want to put the shoulder underneath it, and of course, as this is not in balance, we clutch down with our heads to keep it from falling. And again, we hold on to it with our hands, or put our thumb underneath it. These are all wrong, because we must leave our shoulder free, and we must be well above the string so that we can move along the whole length of the fingerboard. We must have flexibility in all the joints. We must have freedom of the elbow. Perhaps little Karen, who has had almost no experience in holding the violin, might show us what the first reactions are. These are the difficulties. Karen is trying to hold the violin with her hands, and she has no freedom that way. Her fingers are almost out of commission and touching each other. She couldn't possibly come way up the fingerboard in that position. Try to move up and down the fingerboard, Karen. You see, she has to move like an earthworm, one part after the other. There is no freedom there. The elbow is either leaning back on the side of the body or leaning out from the body instead of in and up. And of course the hold of the violin under the chin is not quite right either. She has therefore no freedom of action on the violin and has no balance as yet. I'm sorry, Karen, to do sit down. I'm sorry to point out all your faults, but they are perfectly natural ones and should merely be corrected already at your stage of beginning. I don't usually play a plastic violin, but this may help to demonstrate the position. You will see better, at least through it. Now, the violin rests on the collarbone, and the head rests lightly on the violin, free to move either from side to side or backwards and forwards. The reason for that is to leave the shoulder quite free. You can see how the shoulder can move that way. The other point of support is at the hand. Here you will notice how high the knuckles are pushed, so as to leave plenty of space, not only between the fingers, as you can see, but between the fingers and the fingerboard. You will notice the space, the rounded space within the hand, between the inside of the hand and the fingerboard. It is important that the violin should be supported and touched only with the fingertip and the soft pad of the thumb. You will also notice that the fingers rise almost vertically off the fingerboard, and that the level of the knuckles from which the fingers fall is above the level of the fingerboard. You will also notice the space between the fingers. They should be trained to fall naturally, equidistant from each other. And in this position, the elbow is free to swing, the shoulder is independent, the fingers can rise well above the fingerboard, there's space everywhere. Karen, perhaps you might show me your hold of the violin. That's very good. If you can increase even more the space between the root joint and the first finger base, and keep that soft, free, that will be very good. Thank you, Karen. Now, to begin to find this hold, I think it is best to start with the violin hanging from the collarbone and the head, and see if we can keep the shoulder free. At this point, everything is hanging and relaxed, and the shoulder, as you will see, is not concerned with the support of the violin. It can be moved away, can be quite independent of the violin. To raise the violin, let us put the thumb on one side of the neck and the second finger on the other, not all the way down, because at this angle, with the hand closer to our body, it's easier to raise the violin and to hold it up. Now, as we raise the violin, you will see the thumb remains in its angle, right angle, vertically, and I lift my head to make room for the violin, for the new angle of the violin. I place the head back on again. All the while, as the violin has been coming up, we have been creating more and more room for the whole arm, which is now quite free. The violin is resting on the pad of the thumb, which is still nearly vertical. I'm not allowing the thumb to support the violin from below the neck, nor to fall into the crook between the fingers, nor do I bring up my shoulder to hold the violin, because then I would lose all the freedom I have been creating with the shoulder free. Perhaps an easier way to find the feel of the violin hold is with the help of a crutch, a wall or a hand. Rosemary, perhaps I might demonstrate on you. Now let me support the violin. Let the arm hang first of all, right down. And now bring up your hand to playing position, not disturbing the softness in the arm, no responsibility in the shoulder. Put your third and fourth finger on the A and E string. Raise the knuckles well above the fingerboard. Keep this straight. Thumb a little more on the side of the neck. Go well into your root joint. Now I will gradually leave go and try to keep the same softness. That's very good. There was perhaps a little strain here. That's fine, Rosemary. Thank you. Now, to achieve this position properly, we'll have to begin with exercises, and we will begin with thumb exercises. This is a good exercise for the thumb joint, rolling it around the neck from its tip to its middle joint. Here's another exercise. If I lift my head and add a finger or two, doing the same motion with thumb, I can rotate the violin between my thumb and fingers. Here is a further exercise which involves not only the thumb, but allows the hand to rise with the elbow and the elbow swing. The thumb does almost the same motion as it did, but as the hand rises, it goes into the root of the thumb, which you can see. This is the fourth thumb exercise, which is in a sense complementary to the last one you have seen. With the head very lightly resting on the chin rest, and the hand in its highest position above the fingerboard, right into the root of the thumb, we lift the violin by means of the thumb alone. Now, for the first time, let us move in the finger. I don't mean by that moving the finger up or down, off the string, along the string, up and down the fingerboard, vibrating, but merely letting the finger rest without pressing the string down, rest lightly on the string, and move again as high as we can above that finger without changing the angle of the first joint of the finger, the joint that is next to the string. In doing this, we must also remember that we must create space inside this hollow between the violin and the arm. To do that, we must let the shoulder drop each time we raise the hand. The shoulder drops back. We must not allow the shoulder to join in the same direction of movement like that. That would paralyze us. But we must do this. Here is Elizabeth doing the complementary exercise. Here the arm remains still, while the violin is being raised by the action of the thumb. All the while, the angle of the first joint of the finger, the joint next to the string, remains constant. The object of this exercise is to increase the strength and the speed of the lift of the fingers and to avoid the clamping down of the fingers on the strings. We come to the important point, the great moment, of applying our pressure to the string. Pressure is again a misnomer, because like hold, it implies a squeezing, but it is actually only the strengthening of the arch of the finger so that it may receive the weight, or a fraction rather, of the weight of the whole arm. In this feeling there is rather an extension, an expansion of space, with the shoulder relaxing, surrendering its weight, relaxing backwards, allowing the elbow to swing a little more around the violin so as again to bring more weight directly vertically over the fingertip. The fingertip must sit squarely over the string so that the string traverses the finger diagonally, and so that some of the soft part of the finger, rests equally on both sides of the string. There's no need to press the string more than this. In other words, the soft part need not be squeezed onto the fingerboard. Only as much as is required to carry the weight that will stop the string at that point so that it may vibrate clearly. The finger also must never pull the string to one side, like that, or push the string away to the other side. In other words, the weight must always fall directly, vertically, squarely on to the string. And this happens with its accompanying sensation in the shoulder and the elbow, as I described, each time a finger comes down, even when it happens microscopically, and in any position on the fingerboard. In fact, the repeated falling of the finger is a very good preparatory exercise to the vibrato. Now that we have secured the finger to its point of contact on the fingerboard, we can begin using the horizontal swing parallel to the fingerboard and the strings. Here, the first joint of the finger, of course, changes its angle from this folded to the almost flat. As we do this exercise, you will notice how the motion goes from the fingers into the knuckles and indeed into the wrist. And we also feel a rise as we pull the violin away, as we move into the flat direction. At no time should the fingers touch each other, neither that way in the flat, nor that way in the folded. Continuing the same horizontal motion, I would like to describe the involvement of the head and the shoulder. As we move our hand, pulling it away from our body, we are pulling the violin away from its hold between the collarbone and the head. The head, therefore, must allow its weight to fall and pull itself back, holding the violin, preventing it from sliding out. On the other hand, when we move the fingers toward the body, the head can be absolutely free of any responsibility. As to the shoulder, which remains quite free of the head, independent of the head, when we pull the violin away, its reaction is to fall back. When we push toward the body, its reaction is to come forward. This, however, does not occur simultaneously in a mechanical way like that, but rather does the shoulder anticipate the hand, making room for it, and it happens in a wave pattern. The movement of the shoulder is, of course, shared by the elbow, which also anticipates. Now we can resolve our three pairs of motions: the vertical, up and down, up and down; the horizontal, with the fingers on one spot, backwards and forward; and the lateral swing of the whole arm into one three-dimensional circle, involving every joint of the fingers, the hand, knuckles, wrist, elbow, and indeed shoulder. First in the clockwise direction, and in the anti-clockwise. Now we have three exercises concerned with the reciprocal flexibility of the thumb and the fingers. In the first, the finger remains on its spot and the thumb is moved, and in fact is helped being moved by the finger. In this exercise, it does not matter if the root of the first finger is very lightly moving against the outside of the fingerboard. In the second exercise, the thumb remains on its spot, and the finger moves either in a palm smack bounce above the thumb, or smack bouncing with the back of the hand below the thumb. This resolves into one action like that. In our third exercise, we are moving the thumb and the finger in opposite directions. We do this all the while we are keeping the lightest possible of holds, both between the collarbone and the head, the chin that is, and on the other hand between the finger and the thumb. Now we come to an interesting motion, the lateral motion across the strings of the fingers. This is the plucking sound, and is perhaps the oldest sound associated with stringed instruments. The harp and the lute, the guitar, even the harpsichord were plucked instruments. In this motion we see that the finger moves across the string. The first joint is always bent, depressed a little bit to get the purchase on the string before releasing it. And the plucking itself that must not ignore the rest of the hand. As you see, there is a sympathetic motion even in the wrist. Now, this motion is possible in all positions, either when the hand is across the strings in this way, or when we bring the fourth finger over to the lowest string, to the G string. Here, as you see, the hand has to be higher, the knuckles have to be higher in order to permit the finger to pluck the string than it is here. We must not forget that to play the violin, we must also be able to move the fingers horizontally along the length of the strings. This way, with each finger, always involving the cooperation of the joints, not only of the finger and the knuckles, but the wrist and the elbow, and in fact the whole arm. We can also move two fingers simultaneously in opposite directions. However, when we move the second and third finger in opposite directions, between the anchors of the first and the fourth finger, there is much less whole arm or even wrist movement. The effort is concentrated more particularly in the fingers and the hand. There are a series of exercises, in fact, in several volumes, called The Independence of the Fingers by Dunis, a remarkable man who invented them, wherein each finger is required to do a different movement. Thus, assuming the third finger to be stationary, the fourth finger does a lateral movement, the second finger a plucking movement, while the first does a vertical movement. If the fourth finger is stationary, for instance, the third finger can do the lateral, the second finger the vertical, and the first finger the plucking. Perhaps if one of you tried to do this, you'd feel like the centipede, who became paralyzed when he began to wonder which foot he should move first. In any case, we've gone about as far as we can with the left hand without hearing what the left hand is doing. But first we will have to learn how to move the bow on the strings, and that will be the subject of our next lesson. We've come to an important point when for the first time we will put the bow to the strings of the violin. It will make a sound, but a very curious, eerie sound, because I don't want whatever finger may be used to press all the way down the fingerboard. If you don't find it easy to find that particular magic spot, you can use the open string. The idea is to use only the balancing requirements in the hand and the carrying of the arm, and to understand the mechanics of the stroke. In fact, we will hold the bow so lightly that we can feel the vibrations of the string in the stick. The bow moves vertically, nearly vertically on the E string and nearly horizontally on the G string. That's their different angles. These are the floating sounds on the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. The mechanics of the stroke involve really two parts, always using the whole arm. In the first part, the upper arm falls away, pulling the bow with it, either on the vertical plane or on the horizontal plane, because otherwise the bow would come forward, bending it if the elbow didn't move. And in the upper part of the bow, the elbow comes forward with a slight rolling of the whole arm into the wrist, like this. We can work on both separately in this way. And in the upper part of the bow, these two actions connect in the middle of the bow, where they must flow freely and smoothly into each other. If you are very observant, you will see that coming from the lower half of the bow, first the upper arm is involved. It's a fall on the vertical plane, but of course it is a pull away on the horizontal plane. And when we reach this middle point, the forearm begins to fall freely on its own, pulling, as it were, the whole arm, the rotation in the arm and the elbow with it, like that. So that the whole motion would look like that. The opposite happens in the up bow. There, first the forearm reaches the middle, carrying the main burden of its own weight, and at a certain point, this weight is taken over by the upper arm, which into a lifted position. This is the way it would look. We have been carrying the bow, and by now our wrists and fingers are probably warm enough for us to concentrate on them. You will notice that when holding the bow in the natural way, they are built, these joints, to move most readily in a vertical axis. This is a simple waving motion, which must be soft and must go into all the joints. We will apply this to the stroke in uneven groups. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and also in fives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The reason for this is that in that way the wave pattern remains uninterrupted and it continues at the same rhythm. We will do it on two strings in order to accentuate the wave pattern. And in 5, Now, it must be understood that the change of level between the two strings is affected entirely by the change of level of the arm. Because if it were left entirely to the wrist, we would have something like this. The bow going at odd angles. Therefore, it must remain on its own plane. The wave pattern is always on the plane of the particular string it is playing on. Conversely, if the wrist were eliminated from motion, and the motion were done entirely with the forearm as a rigid unit, it would look like this. Which is too rigid for violin playing. We've seen in the wave motion how the pattern was repeated every 2 notes. Now, if we continue with this and play 1 note on each complete pattern, we will get retakes on either the down bow, like that, or the up bow, on the different planes of the different strings. Of course, we must remember, in this case, that the fingers must hold the bow in a way quite firmly. They must not lose their spot of contact. But on the other hand, of course, there must be sufficient flexibility to allow for the big movements of the arm into the wrist, the knuckles. Two notes. We would have done 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You will see that in this motion, an added motion is required at the end of the stroke, because if we do 1, 2, the up bow having to begin that way, it must be prepared. Therefore, we have to do 1, 2, and 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 1, 2, so on. This would look on the violin as follows. You will notice the extra motion at the end of each stroke. If you watch indulgence in fancy motions and hold the bow properly, using mainly the arm for the motion, this allows us to carry the weight continually. On the other hand, I don't want you to get this pressure without motion. So we will use the same 2 notes, but extend one of them, returning to our swing motion at the end for our change of direction. You will notice that in this figure on 2 strings, we have a pattern of a horizontal 8 lying on its side. It can also lie on the other side. But even when we draw a note on 1 string, there must anything that comes into your head, keep it going. That's the main thing. The bow moves at the same speed. If you use the same length of bow on each note, of course, the shorter notes will be that's a different bow speed, and you must become acquainted with different bow speeds. If you tighten the little notes, they will come. That is a very good exercise. If you leave the first of the little notes out, you will get this pattern. But we must still feel the unspoken, unsung note in that pattern. The hand must be always in continuous motion. And then if we tuck in a few little notes, we get a certain continuous speed and fast note. At the frog, at this point of the bow, to do that, you must keep the wrist fairly flexible and keep the elbow high enough above the bow so that the wrist can move in a horizontal direction. Otherwise, you will get its vertical sound. You want to get that quality. This brings us to the détaché, one of the basic strokes of violin playing. This is always a drawn stroke. You're drawing the string without crime, a certain abandon. The abandon to the motion that you are studying and that you are cultivating. As soon as you lose that abandon, you will lose the pleasure in playing, and then you'd better put your violin down until you can refresh yourself. In the next lesson, I would like to prove to you that all motions in the left hand on the fingerboard grow out of one basic waving seed, if you could make that analogy. It is true that we have to vibrate, that we have to shift, that we have to use different fingers, but all of these begin at the same point, and perhaps we can begin at that point now. First of all, I would like to give you two basic exercises, merely to strengthen the fingers. These have nothing to do with the motion, with the proper undulating motion, which we will speak of immediately afterwards. We must always think in terms of two directions. The one outward, away from our body, pulling the violin away, the other inward. Supposing in the outward direction, and again we must never forget that whenever we pull in the outward direction, we must combine it always with a little lift. We go into the extended position of the finger. The finger is extended and pulling away. Keeping up the same pull, we bring the finger by its own efforts into the bent position. And then we can release slowly, or we can release quickly. Both must be practiced. We pull in and we release out. In the opposite direction, we begin with the folded position. We are pushing the violin into our necks. Our forearm is coming closer to us. And with the finger's own strength, it extends itself against this push. It releases slowly, or it can release quickly. It's like a spring action. And this should be done with each finger on each string in about 3 different positions on the fingerboard. Approximately here, not at the very end, because you won't have space to spring back. Approximately the middle of this neck. Again, somewhere where the shoulder begins to be felt, the shoulder of the violin, and again above the shoulder. That is the first exercise. Would any of you like to see this next one a little more closely? Rosemary, you bring your stool, I'll sit down, and then you can watch while standing. Now look carefully. Continuing with this idea of effort and release, we have 3 ways of going from a lower position, that is, this part of the fingerboard, to a higher, and equally 3 ways of bringing ourselves down. The first is simply an alternate motion of direction away and back, with the stress on the away and back, away and back, away and back. The second is what the children call a caterpillar, when it's repeated a few times. In this case, we pull the violin away from us, bring our knuckles in, and release the hand. And if done several times, looks like the caterpillar indeed. The third way is what they call a catapult. And that is when we begin in the bent position, still pushing the violin towards us, pushing the knuckles back, sort of getting our enormous spring, and then releasing. In, pushing the knuckles back, and the arm, which wants to go towards us, is being restrained by the finger. We release the finger, and it comes up. Now, the three ways to descend the fingerboard. We begin again in the bent position towards our body and alternate with the other direction. Only this time the stress is in the upwards, towards us direction, and release is the other way. The next way down is bent again, pushing, then it's the caterpillar, pushing the knuckles out, and this is, and the third way is the beginning extended, pulling away from us, bringing the knuckles in, and we have our catapult when we release. The arm is pulling away from us, and when we unbend the finger, we go away. These three ways should be practiced, of course, on all the strings with each finger, including the fourth, never forget the fourth, and in at least two parts of the fingerboard, shall we say, from the neck to the shoulder, and from the shoulder of the violin to about here. Is that clear, Rosemary?
Yeah.
Good. Well, then we can go on to the next point. You probably remember that when we were dealing with the bow, we used two smack bounces, one in each direction, to connect the directions. And when we played triplet rhythm, we were able to keep that going all the time. Now, we will do the same thing with the left hand. If we do one smack bounce in the backward direction, we get this motion. And in the forward direction, we get this one. If we connect them in triplet rhythm, we have smack bounce, smack bounce, smack bounce, smack bounce. It sounds rather awful, but don't you worry about that. It sounds like a cat meowing. That's perfectly all right. It's a good, healthy sound for a young violinist. These motions should also be every pair in a circle. So that actually, in the groups of 6, you have 3 twice, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but you also have every 2 a circle, and don't forget the lift in the circle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. I think I've proven my point now that at least 2 of the motions associated with the left hand, the vibrato and the shifting, are born of the same motion. If this motion is restricted to a narrow amplitude and accelerated in speed, you get your vibrato. And if we allow the finger to move, well, having done all these exercises, you should be now able to attempt some of these I would like to show you. You remember our backwards and forwards triplet motion. We can apply it now to broken thirds, fourths, fifths, as we care. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. If we wish to do them faster, we lose the 2, 3. We do 1, 1 in this way. We can can apply that as well to other intervals. Thus the fourth, or fifth, or seventh, we come to the finger fall, and although, as we know, it is a vertical motion of the fingers, it must, however, be coordinated with the horizontal, our famous waving motion in the knuckles, immediately behind the fingers, and indeed with the wrist and with the forearm. We do this in triplet rhythm again, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is the natural way for the finger to fall when it is playing in one position. However, when we shift positions in this way, it is more natural because of the major movement of the forearm to incorporate the finger fall in this way. The finger falls, this finger, say, falls, as we move down, so it becomes a fall in the outward motion instead of in the inward motion of the forearm, this way. Or and this is, of course, very useful in scales with pairs of fingers or sec 2 and 3 or 3 and 4. This is applied to double stops when we use two pairs of fingers in this way. And in arpeggios on one string, where we remember the arpeggios we did with one finger, which is the basis of this shifting with in pairs of fingers, one motion for each shift, which is the motion that we applied when we went into high gear, as it were, with the double motion, with the pairs of fingers. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, not worrying any longer about several shakes on one note. Single movement, one wave to two notes. And this falls into the natural, rhythmic, vibrating motion of the hand as did every other action of the fingers. This lateral action is one which normally only the violinist himself sees. But I'd like to show it to you. You'll be doing it, and you might as well see how it works. You will notice that going down the scale, the third and second fingers have to span two strings in order to roll off the one. This rolling action is necessary whenever we play fifths to correct them to the proper pitch. Playing fifths in a higher position has other problems. And in addition, I might say, and that is that the strings are wider apart and higher above the fingerboard. This means that a finger playing might easily fall in between the strings, which wouldn't do. Therefore, we pull the strings together and we enable any finger to play. Or so that's adjusted. The first finger, having no one to pull behind it, pulls the string itself, rolls over on the other, and allows them to settle in a medium position. Like that. Speaking of pressure on strings, we have chords that require even more, as 3 or 4 fingers may hold the strings down at the same time. This requires great elasticity and strength, and you had better not try these until you have developed your hand sufficiently. Well, I've been doing all the talking. I wonder if I might enjoy some of the fruits of my labors. John and Elizabeth, would you like to play something for me? Very good. Delighted. That's fine. Both. These are on the violin. And... But, Karen, there's something missing there, isn't there? What would you say?
There's no body string.
That's quite right. We have 2 main directions in our body. We pivot one way and we pivot another. And this corresponds on the violin to... And the other direction is the swing of the 2 arms together, which on the violin takes rather this form. And that sounds like this. Now I would like to consider these large motions in greater detail, with particular reference to the knuckles. Now I would like to show you several complete motions on one stroke, both in the left and the right hands at the same time. This we might call a 2-hand staccato. As a held note in the left hand requires a stroke in the right hand, the coordination of both hands requires that the release should occur with a shift in the left hand and an almost stoppage in the right hand. This is the way it would look slowly. As the stroke, the individual... Now, when we go back to the E string, if the violin remained at this angle, the bow would be going this way, and the left hand would be far too much around, like that. We restore the angle to this. You may notice that when playing in a lower position, the bow is in a different place between the fingerboard and the bridge than in an upper position. The reason for that is that the bow must always cross the string to make the best sound at a particular proportion of that string's length. As the length shortens, so does its place between the fingerboard and the bridge. cover twice the distance and would be too wide. So we must never forget that as the distance is narrow between notes as we go up the fingerboard, so does the amplitude of the vibrato adjust itself to the same. Of course, we may want to vibrate very narrowly in a low position in classical music where we don't want to use too wide a vibrato. We may play very narrowly in a low position. And again, there may be certain places that shouldn't have any vibrato at all. You remember this motion that we did in the left hand, because I'm reminded of it by the narrowness of the vibrato, which corresponds with the narrow. Important to collect your thoughts, to free your joints. It brings with it a great sense of calm, and is furthermore very good for this coordination. You forget about it when you play, of course. We've come to the end of our general survey of violin playing. Inevitably, many things remain unsaid, even specific things, as the thrown bow ricochet and artificial harmonics, and beyond that 1,000 other exercises I would like to have given you, and which I myself will continually evolve, and I hope you will evolve on your own as well, because with the building blocks which we have covered, you should be able to build your own techniques as far as you wish to take them. Violin playing is essentially an art of self-discovery.